Hello, my name is Christine Gelley. I am the Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Educator in Noble County, Ohio, and it is a pleasure to be here today at South Centers. As a member of the Ohio State University Forages team, I have a guest here with me, Bob Hendershot, to talk about National Forages Week.
Hello, and we welcome you to joining us. We're going to talk about the American Forage and Grassland Council. It's a organization that has affiliate councils in many of the eastern states. I think we have 24 different states that are represented, mostly the eastern states where we deal with pasture and hay, though we do have Oregon. Oregon's out there. That's where a lot of our grass seed is produced, so Oregon has a council as well. But in Ohio, we have the Ohio Forage and Grassland Council. It was started here in southern Ohio. Mr. Bob Evans was a big promoter of the Ohio Forage and Grassland Council and really pushed and encouraged us to get organized. And that happened in 1996. So we've been operating since then. I happen to have been the second president elected to the Ohio Forage and Grassland Council and became active in the American Forage and Grassland Council, and I'm pleased to have been the president of the American Forage and Grassland Council, the first Ohioan to serve in that capacity. Since then, we've Gary Wilson, also one of the founders of the Ohio Forage and Grassland Council, has become president of the American Forage and Grassland Council, and now Chris Penrose, one of your mentors, I was going to say cohorts, in eastern Ohio. He's an educator with OSU Extension in Morgan County. We go through a succession of years before you become president, so you kind of learn how to do the job. And Chris will be our president in 3 more years of the American Forage and Grassland Council. But National Forage Week is one of those weeks where we try to promote forages across the country. Forages are important, and hopefully we'll share some of those reasons why. In Ohio, it's an important part of our agricultural enterprises. You got to realize ruminant animals, cows and sheep, even wildlife like deer, all eat forages. So we try to keep forages on the minds of people and how important they are in the country and across the country. Forages, if you would add them all up, utilize more land than any other single crop. So in the Corn Belt states like Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, we think of corn and soybeans being the primary crops, but if you get outside of the Corn Belt, forages are very important to us. And we like to promote the wise use of some of our forages and how important they are to us in a lot of the things that we deal with.
They absolutely are important. If you think about that, livestock feed America and forages feed livestock.
Look, that's right. And we can grow forages on places we can't grow crops. And
Many
thus
places.
We can generate food for us, humans, where we couldn't grow grains and other things, so fruits and vegetables. So we can grow forages on a lot of places. And, I've had the privilege of traveling across the country, and you get up into the mountains in some of the western states where nothing but grass can grow. It's nice to have it, and understanding how grass grows, that you got to harvest the grass, or it loses. It starts to fade away if we don't do something with it. So forages we try to harvest, and for most of us, we like to use grazing animals.
Absolutely. It's a lot easier than using a tractor or a brush hog.
So I retired from the USDA, United States Department of Agricultural, Natural Resources Conservation Service, as the state grassland conservationist in Ohio. So that's been a few years ago, but we did a lot of my work as a professional is dealing with forages and getting people to understand, and we helped do grazing schools. You've been part of some of our grazing schools in eastern Ohio, and that's one of the things we talk about, try to get the animals to work for us.
Absolutely. The animals work for you. You don't work for the animals. So
that's right.
Put them to work.
So we got to think of making the animals our employees as a farmer, and not going out harvesting the feed and bringing it to them. We try to think about using the animals to go out and gather their own feed, deposit their own manure, and then where we don't use equipment to handle all those things. So
Right.
saves a little money.
The less equipment we use, the less issues we have with things like compaction and also erosion.
That's right. So forages are important to us for environmental reasons, with being part of the Conservation Service. I understand I'm old, Christine, so I started with the USDA. I was the Soil Conservation Service, and where the primary interest was on conserving the soil and protecting it with conservation practices, and it evolved in the mid-'80s to the natural resources conservation, where we looked at more than just soil. We looked at water and plants and animals and all the different parts of the natural resources, and more than just soils. But forages covers a lot of those things in terms of dealing with water quality and soil quality and animal health. So the forages cover a lot of those different situations that we deal with.
Absolutely. And when you mentioned animal health, thinking of our small ruminant producers, pasture management is essential to managing parasites.
Yes.
For just one example, appropriately managing forages reduces parasite loads for small ruminants. So it's about more than just the grass or the clovers that cover the soil surface. It goes far, far beyond that.
And many people think of pasturing and as being a simple, but it's very, very complicated, because you're managing the field and the growing of the crop with the animals at the same time. When you grow corn, you just plant it, it grows, you harvest it, bring it back and feed it to the animals, and maybe redeposit the manure that they generate back out on the field. But in a grazing system, you're managing all that simultaneously. So if you manage the animals too intensely, you hurt the forages, which ends up hurting the soil. So you try to manage everything in harmony and in balance, and it's a complicated system if you don't understand how all the pieces play together.
Right.
So.
No pasture, no hay field, no forage system is a monoculture.
No.
There is diversity in every one of those systems, which makes them extremely interesting, flexible, versatile, but also has its own unique challenges.
Yes. So yes, a true pasture manager, or a grass farmer as we call them, has to balance all those things, and we look at diversity. And it's one of the things we look at when we're evaluating pastures and hay fields. The more different variety of plants, forage plants you have in the field, the healthier it is. When we see a pasture field moving to just a monoculture, we know it's not being managed at its fullest potential, and productivity starts to lose, and you start to lose some of that natural diversity that we like to see. Birds and insects and the flora and fauna in the soil start to degrade as well. And Piketon's a great place to talk about soil health.
Certainly.
But that's one of the things we look at, is the health of the soil and all the diversity of life within the soil. And it's very prominent in a well-managed forage pasture field that we have a huge diversity of soil life. And that's the basis of all living things, is what's growing in the soil, things we don't see. So as I work with farmers and field days and things, many times you usually find me in the field with a spade, and we'll dig up some of the soil and we'll look at it. And it's easy to see the earthworms because you don't need a microscope. But if you see lots of earthworms, that means there's lots of things we cannot see with the naked eye that are in the soil. And when we dig in the soil and don't find any earthworms, then we have to be worried that we don't have enough food for them. That's the reason they're not there, is that there's not enough nourishment in the soil to feed them. So we look at that, and it goes back to the plants, Christine, because it's the plants that's feeding those little animals and plants in the soil, because all the energy comes from the sun. The leaves of the plants collect that soil energy, convert it into sugars, and a lot of those sugars go back down into the roots, and not only feed the roots, but they leak it out into the soil to feed the the microorganisms that live in the soil that end up feeding the worms that we see in the soil. So it all bases on, so you have a healthy pasture and forage field, we're feeding that. And I tease my corn farmers all the time that their plants are only alive in the soil for 100, 110 days. Pasture field, the plants are alive 365 days a year. May not be actively growing when it's really hot or really cold, but they're still out there and they're still alive.
They never rest.
They never rest. And that's what's not. Unlike even in the forest, our deciduous forest, the trees go dormant and aren't actively growing when the leaves aren't on them, but our forage plants are actively growing and keeping that soil life alive. So we have a much healthier soil when we have a good, healthy sod, or us pasture guys call it a sward, which is a mixture of plants, grasses, legumes, and forbs. Some people call them weeds, but
Well, it depends on your perspective,
That's
whether
right.
a forb is a weed or a weed is a forb.
it depends on if the animal will eat it or not.
Absolutely does.
That's right.
Well, I hope that we've got people excited, some about forages. Let's talk more about National Forages Week.
National Forage Week.
When is it?
June 17th to the 23rd.
Okay.
This will be our fourth effort, or fourth year that we've promoted National Forage Week, we being the American Forage and Grassland Council. So it's an effort where we try to reach out, and if you go to our site, our website, www.afgc.org, there's a lot of information about forages as well, and some of the activities are going on. We have AFGC is unique in the fact that it's a blend of producers, industry, and extension or university people, those that are doing research. So it brings everybody together. And when we have our annual meetings and conferences, all three phases come together, and a lot of the researchers get information or ideas from the producers, and in return the producers are receiving back information, and the industry's there gathering from both sides on what the next rung on the ladder of forage management is going to be. So it's a really great, I love walking through our displays of vendors at our trade show and just learning all the new technology that's coming available to us at our annual meetings of the American Forage. We do a similar, much smaller scale here in Ohio with the Ohio Forage and Grassland Council. One of your old professors was our main speaker last February.
Yes.
Dr. Pat Kaiser.
From the University of Tennessee.
Yes. Had some
Go
good
Bulls.
stories about Christine that I can't share all of them. Huh? But
I wouldn't believe everything Pat tells you.
But Pat was one of our speakers at AFGC. We had the pleasure of having him here in Ohio to talk about warm season grasses. And the native warm season grasses were what were here when the Europeans came. That's what the Native Americans dealt with in terms of forages. And even in Ohio, we had a lot of grassland acres that were available to us. I grew up, or didn't grow up, but I live in Pickaway County, part of the Pickaway Plains, which is between Chillicothe and Circleville. And that was a large area of native growing grass that fed the herds of bison. We had the eastern woodland bison here in Ohio that, just like the Great Plains bison, only they're slightly genetically different, but they would, it's kind of like the difference between a Hereford and an Angus. Same species, but they look a little different. But we had animals here that lived on grasslands and grazed them, and so we like to talk about that. But typically the forages we have now in the United States are ones that came over from Europe, like a lot of us, our ancestors did as well. They brought with them the seeds and the plants that they knew how to manage best. Mm-hmm. So a lot of our cool season grasses that we think are native to United aren't really from the United States. Like Kentucky bluegrass did not come from Kentucky. Okay,
Right.
It just performs
Despite
very
what the
well
name
there.
tells you.
Yeah, it came from Europe. Orchard grass and tall fescue and meadow fescue and a lot of those species all came from the European continent or continent of Europe and Eurasia. Alfalfa is another one, red clovers. All those things came from, we've learned how to adapt to them and how they fit into our system. So
yeah, well, we also have lots of forages, more of the warm season annuals that would even come from continents like Africa.
yes, the names like Sudan grass pretty obviously came from the country of Sudan. So
And when you look at corn,
yes,
I mean, that's considered a forage too. That
Yes.
makes
Oh,
a
yes.
lot of silage.
we put
And
them.
that's from South America.
Yes.
So our American forage system is much like the citizens of America. We have a big melting pot of forages.
And so it goes into how we manage forage. It's a complicated system because we can pull from so much and utilize. You get to southern United States and Bermuda grass, not a native plant. It came in as well. So we have a lot of those. One we talk about here in southern Ohio, Johnson grass, it was imported as well as a forage, and it got away. For corn farmers, they didn't like Johnson grass for many years, but in terms of pastures, it didn't perform well, or in the fact that cows liked it so much they tend to graze it out, so it wasn't very persistent. So you guys got Johnson grass weed problems, put the cows out there, they'll take care of that. So
They will.
it wasn't a problem until we went to more continuous row cropping. So
Right. What are some other things we can share with folks about
some of
American
our-
forages?
excuse me, protecting our environment, and we like to see that in terms of the next generation. I'm a grandfather now, so I think about my grandchildren and what's the world going to be like for them in terms of keeping the soil in place. We talked about that early in terms of healthy soil and conservation and keeping a good, healthy, green growing plant out there to protect the soil and keep it in place. So one of our speakers, besides Dr. Kaiser at American, was David Montgomery, who has written several books on how the loss of soil has failed civilizations. So if we looked at many of the ancient civilizations, died out because of soil erosion. They mismanaged the soil, or just maybe didn't know how to better manage, and they lost their potential to produce food for their people. And we need to think about that as how we can manage our resources to continue to produce food, not only for ourselves, but our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, and how we can manage our resources to maintain that productive food base, or the base to generate foods for us. So it's important to us. And like you mentioned, there's also the diversity. Just if we have a good diverse plant base out there, then it generates a lot of diverse insects and animal life. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we've been working with recently is with the Division of Wildlife on some of our forages as for ground nesting birds and grassland birds.
Things like quail,
yes,
pheasants, grouse.
They all utilize the grasslands, and many of our grassland birds are becoming, I'll use the word endangered, but their populations are dwindling.
Threatened, I believe is what they're labeled now.
Yeah. We've lost a lot of that
habitat
for them. Yes, it's not out there. When I was a boy, most of the farms had forages on them, but you drive across Ohio now, and there's lots and lots of farms that don't have forages on their operations anymore.
Right. The landscape is changing, just as people are changing, as the world's demand changes. But I think, however it changes in the future, forages are still going to be an essential part of that system.
I believe so.
And I wouldn't be surprised if at some point in time we see more of those monocultures shifting back to a diverse forage system.
And I guess one of the things we look at is the cover crop push, which is bringing diversity back to row crops with annuals, but we're starting to get a more diverse landscape with the use of cover crops in our row crops, corn and soybean type rotations, and even into wheat, where we're planting in after wheat harvest here in another month or so. Many farmers are introducing forage type plants. My friends call them cover crops, but
Forages, too.
I tend to call them forages because they may not be grazed by domestic animals, but the wildlife tend to graze and utilize them as well. So
Right, and if they're not used as a grazable forage, then they're used as a fertilizer.
yes, so they start to build that soil resource base back. So it's an ever-growing, stimulating, and it keeps me alive, I guess.
Me too.
And exciting.
That's why we're here together.
That's right.
Well, you mentioned about the soil health.
Yes.
I think sometimes it's really hard for people to grasp how much soil there really is. Say in 1 acre, how many pounds of soil is there?
So
Isn't it 6 million pounds
Well-
in an acre furrow slice?
2 million pounds.
2 million pounds in the
it,
top.
6 2/3 inches.
Yeah, and that's
So-
where most of our root growth will be for
Yes.
our cool season plants, but then those warm season
Can go down
natives,
deeper.
down 4 feet or deeper,
Deeper.
that's holding all that soil on that surface.
So we noticed that in my work years ago when we had the big flood on the Mississippi River, where they had native plants growing that rooted very deep, the levees held. And when they went in to investigate, those roots went clear through the dikes and the levees down into the parent soil, and helped hold that levee. Where they did not have deep-rooted native plants, the levees tend to fail because those roots didn't help hold the soil together.
Right. If we think more about water too, we didn't mention that the grass cover is an excellent filter.
Oh, yes, and that's one of the things we look at in terms of water quality with some of our soil forages. We use our forages or forage-type plants in a lot of our buffers, conservation practices, the big grass waterways. Grass is part of that, is what we're utilizing to transfer water safely, uneroding from one spot to another, and have an excess water flow off of areas, fields, in a safe manner. And we're using the grass plants as a way of filtering out pollutants, sediment from the streams.
Extra fertilizer.
Yes, nutrients that could get into the water sources. So we like the use of some of our forage plants for that. A lot of our food comes from forages. As we get into the month of June, my favorite month, dairy.
Dairy month.
Ice
Let's
cream.
talk about Ice cream.
Yeah, ice cream. Christine knows me.
I had
Ice
some
cream.
last night.
So a lot of our milk comes from the use of cows eating forages. Forages tend to put more butter fat into the milk, ice cream, butter, and a lot of those things that use the milk fat as part of their, in the process, comes from the forages. So we like to, another reason to thank, and one of the reasons we selected June for National Forage Week is the fact it's also Dairy Month.
Dairy
And
month.
so we get to use it.
Thank goodness it's a whole month. So I'm going to eat about 2 of those 22 gallons that we consume a year
That's right.
in that first week of June.
I may help raise that average up by 22 gallons. So that's one of my things. I like milk. I still drink a lot of just fresh milk every day. So
How many
with
gallons of milk? 24 billion
Gallons
gallons of milk each year.
cheer.
And I think that's about 1 gallon per person in America per week.
Per week.
That's incredible.
Yes. And then we talked a little bit more about the insects, but the legumes that have the pretty flowers, think of red and white clovers, and alfalfa have purple flowers, and some alfalfa even have pink and white flowers. But
I even like the flowers that don't look like flowers.
There you go. But they provide the nectar and the pollen for a lot of our insects. And understanding the animal world, insects are a lot of food for some of our ground nesting birds and other birds as well. So we like to see the legumes out in our fields as well. So not only forage, they also are feeding part of the other part of the earth habitat in terms of wildlife and different things. So we enjoy our forages.
Yeah, in many, many ways. I enjoy looking at forages. There's some forages I enjoy eating just right from the source.
Yeah.
We'll be honest. And then there's ice cream, milk, beef, lamb.
That's right.
They all come from forages.
All right, yes. Then there's a big movement now on grass-based agriculture. Grass-based beef, pasture-raised beef, and I've working with a few dairies in my consulting business that are moving toward grass-based dairy, where they're not getting any grain, the cows, just forages in their diet. So there's been a movement toward that, and we found some healthy reasons to do that. It lowers the bad cholesterol and raises the good cholesterol in the products that we eat, the meat and the milk.
Doesn't it change fatty acid composition?
Yes.
And
So you're the scientist. You're getting into the fatty acids.
if we look at human nutrition, that
Yes.
is an important
right.
thing to look at for a lot of people.
And some of the amino acid complexes in the meat themselves. So on my own little farm, that's one of the things we do is we graze animals to finish on grasses.
And it can be done.
Yes, it takes a high level, or I won't say a high level, but a higher level of management and a high quality of forage. Because if you've raised livestock, you know it takes a lot of energy to finish an animal. I don't say my animals aren't just raised on pasture; they're finished, which means that their body composition is such that when you harvest them, there's
It's still that high quality
the meat
eating
pleasure
experience,
yes.
right?
As we get close to grilling season now in the summertime, and the steaks and the hamburger are raised, so the meat is there.
We like that good fat
Yes,
in there.
that's
So
where the flavor's at.
if we
and the
can provide
juiciness.
them that concentrated source of nutrients still in our pasture, they will develop that fat.
Right. So and that's what I meant by finished, is that they have
Right.
marbled, and they get the little coating on it, because you need a little fat coating on them, so when they are harvested, they chill out. The meat drops from the body temperature to a refrigerated level at a slow, steady pace, and it doesn't dry out or cool too rapidly. You want it to cool down slowly. So I've learned a lot about meat in my last few years.
That's another reason that we are
Yes.
definitely thankful for forages, and a reason why we all should celebrate National Forages Week
Right.
this June.
That's right.
If you are in Southeast Ohio, you should come on out for Southeast Ohio Hay Day, which is June 21st. It's a Thursday evening. Starting at 4 p.m., there will be a trade show, equipment demonstrations, and educational programming. It's free. You can find more information on forages.osu.edu. Thanks for coming out and talking with me today, Bob.
Well, thank you, Christine. I enjoy this. Forages are one of my passions.
Mine too.
All right.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.